Good morning, everyone. Next up, we have our first panel discussion. Our topic is the impact of renewable energy on national security policy. Our moderator for today is General Wesley Clark. He's the co-chair of Growth Energy, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, and he also serves as chairman and CEO of Wesley K. Clark and Associates, senior fellow at UCLA's Berkowitz Center, and advisor at the Blackstone Group.
So we've got a good panel this morning. We want to talk about climate change, national security, renewable energy, and all those things. And I want to ask my fellow panelists, Sherri and John and Andrea, if they'll just each take a minute and tell you a little about themselves and what their engagement is in this set of issues. And then we're going to talk about climate change and national security, the military, renewable energy, and how it all fits, what policy changes we might need as we move ahead. Sherri?
Well, thank you very much, Wes. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you this morning. Some people call me the mother of climate security. I began in this field with John, with General Clark, when he was head of Southcom and I was Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security in the 1990s in the Clinton administration, where we were moving the Department of Defense in that era from being seen as an environmental laggard at a time when there were many Superfund sites across the country and violations of clean air and water laws to an era where the military has since become an environmental leader across the board on everything from environmental conservation to climate change and now to clean and advanced energy. 10 years ago, this year, I founded the Military Advisory Board at the Center for Naval Analysis, where I served for many years, and that brought together generals and admirals like General Clark. Now there have been over 30 of them. We've produced 7 reports. The first landmark report was Climate Change and the Threat of National Security, where we define climate change as a threat multiplier, a phrase that if you follow this field, you've probably heard everybody from President Obama to many other, even Republican leaders use. And this has now become sort of a field of inquiry, both deep research by academics, but also throughout the military and the intelligence community today. We've seen a lot of responsible leadership at everything from strategy to operations plans and policy. I continue that work in various forms with the CNA Military Advisory Board. I also work on some of these related issues like water security that we were just talking about with Lester Brown, and we can get into that area as well. And I ran an ocean science research organization called the Consortium for Ocean Leadership with many leading ocean science research organizations, and also now work a lot on things polar and Arctic. And tomorrow in Washington, we'll be having a very large gathering of the Arctic Circle with leading senators and presidents and foreign leaders to talk about the changes in the Arctic and how we prepare to live in this new region. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Sherri. John?
Thank you, sir. John Powers. I first got interested in energy, clean energy and climate actually as a first lieutenant deployed to Iraq. I was stationed in Baghdad in one of Uday Hussein's palace, and this is in 2003, 2004. We had a group of Iraqis who lived on our base and worked with us every day, and we knew when they left the base, they took a certain amount of intel with them, and we knew that if they left at 6 o'clock, by 6:45, we'd receive mortar rounds wherever our fuel trucks were. And so we knew that by 6:15, we had to move the trucks. And that was my first understanding of the idea of energy security. And then I began to focus on it academically, used to cite all of Sherri's work in my Johns Hopkins master's, and focus on the idea of clean energy as a solution to this. Went and served both at the Pentagon as the first special advisor on energy to the Army, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, helping stand up their policies around insulation and operational energy. And then later served as President Obama's chief sustainability officer of the federal government, so oversaw what all the agencies from the White House oversaw what all the agencies were doing, both for energy and sustainability, but also for climate planning within their own operations. And in that role, saw a need to bring more capital to bear to the clean energy space. And after leaving government, I co-founded a company called Clean Capital with actually folks that I had served with in the military who'd all gone into clean energy separately, and rallied around this idea, which I'm happy to talk about more later, but to bring more capital to bear to the clean energy space.
Thank you. Andrea?
Good morning. My name is Andrea Yodsampa, and I run a not-for-profit called Deploy US, and we're focused on building support across the political spectrum for national climate and energy policy. My deep background is energy and environmental policy, professionally and academically, but I spent many years working with the US military to support civil-military coordination in places like Afghanistan. And I, among other things, taught negotiation at a number of military academies and helped develop methodologies and even software tools for the military to use when they find themselves needing to coordinate with civilians on the non-combat aspects of the military mission. So for example, reconstruction, stabilization operations. So 3.5 years ago, when I decided that this issue of climate and clean energy was too important to me personally, not to throw all of my weight, whatever weight I have behind trying to help solve, and I was pivoting back to my professional roots, I did a 6-month self-financed strategic gap analysis. And the question I was trying to answer was, looking at global action to solve this problem, what were the major systemic levers that could be pulled to unlock global solutions? And even though almost my entire career had been internationally focused, I discovered that one of the most powerful levers that could be pulled was within the US Republican Party. And I began looking at what the opportunities were to get away from the misbranding of the climate issue as a liberal environmental activist issue. And again, this pointed me back to the military because I saw, of course, that so much powerful work led by the 3 people on this podium and many others had been done within the military and national security sector at the climate security nexus. And the voice was credible and powerful and non-political, and yet it wasn't getting as much impact or traction, especially in political circles, as it needs to. And so I sought to understand, what could be done pragmatically to amplify that message, and among other things, ended up co-founding a network with the Center for Climate and Security to bring military national security leaders together with other credible messengers on this issue, including business leaders and conservative religious leaders. And we have a network and a project called the Military Business Faith Project, which we sometimes call Military Money and Morals, to do this. And I'm happy to share more about that in the context of the conversation.
Okay, thanks. So you see we've got a lot of experience and a lot of talent here. Now I want to ask our audience here, if we identify climate change as a national security issue, how many of you would agree with that? Raise your hand, let's see. Exactly. We're speaking to the choir. And yet, most of the American public doesn't see it as a national security issue. They might say ISIS is a national security issue. Now they don't like North Korea. Some people don't like Putin. But what we want to do is, let's just make sure, since we're the choir, we're all singing from the same notes. So let's ask the members of the panel, why do you feel that climate change is a national security issue? Let's go right down. Sherri, you put a lot of time into this.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's abundantly clear, and it's been confirmed even by current Secretary of Defense General Mattis, that climate change is affecting our troops where they are operating today. We see this everything from the increase, what the military likes to call demand signal for humanitarian affairs and disaster relief, HADR missions, particularly in the disaster alley of the Asia Pacific, where the storms are increasingly intense and affecting larger numbers of people in urban areas from Indonesia across all the way across the region. And we see this from happening where we now know that some of the underlying causes of the instability in Syria and in the Arab Spring were the prolonged droughts that occurred in the region before that, both in Syria and the droughts that prompted Russia, for example, in 2011 to halt the export of wheat to the Middle East. So we've been able now to reconstruct those events, and it's very clear from the work that's been done by both within the national security community writ large, within DoD, within its associated academic and analytic institutions, within the intelligence community, that this is very well understood. We also see it very vividly at our key installations at home in the US today. You have to look no further than Hampton Roads, Norfolk, the largest complex of naval installations in the world, and many others, where they have regular sunny day flooding that prevent people from getting on base, that require people living in the community to have to drive around, work around, and change their lives to be able to accommodate the combination of sea level rise, coastal inundation, and storm surge that's occurring in this region. And so this is affecting military installations across the country. And it's also affecting the way the military trains and operates. Think of the Arctic. We are now preparing to operate in a region that was previously inaccessible to all but our submarines, right? And now we need to have more icebreakers. We may need a deep water port. We need to plan and prepare for actual surface traffic occurring, navigation, transport, shipping. In many ways, that was unthinkable even 10 years ago. This is a region that is where the sea ice is melting at twice the rate of the rest of the planet, and in our life, and is also changing the lives of people who live there as the permafrost shrinks, and we'll have to think about relocating key communities in the region. So this is very well understood. As Andrea and John know well, particularly Andrea's recent work, partly because of the politicization of climate change in this country, even though there are many Republicans in the Senate and in the House. In fact, there is a bipartisan coalition caucus now in the House called the Climate Solutions Caucus. And I would encourage any of you who are interested in this area to sort of go on their website. They continue to add members, and they call it the Noah's Ark Caucus because for every, always have to add one Republican and one Democrat. And we see increasingly that members want to, they know they have to take this seriously because it's affecting their constituents. And for many of them, it's easier to do this in the context of climate security, climate solutions is part of what they call this caucus. Many of them have military installations in their district, so they're hearing it from their communities.
John?
The simplest answer is yes, it's a national security risk. I challenge everyone in the room to do three things. One, watch the film Age of Consequences. It will scare you to the bone, but also drive you to action. Two, go back and read the Military Advisory Board papers that started in the mid-2000s, late 2000s?
2007.
Right, these weren't written by fluffy environmentalists. These are all retired four-star flag officers, admirals and generals in the military. And then point to those. When you have conversations with people that question this concept, it's hard to talk national security unless you're a national security expert. Say, look, it's not me that's saying this, it's the Pentagon that is saying this, and saying this regularly, and they've been saying it for a decade, and this is the risk. So, you know, we could talk at length. I mean, Sherri really laid out the argument well, so I don't want to reiterate it, but just give you some tools that go and point folks who challenge you on it to say, look, you know, Senator Inhofe will challenge our military leaders on national security. Turn around and ask Senator Inhofe where he's getting his money from, right? The military leaders aren't getting their money from the Petroleum Institute, right? They care about the mission that they're supporting. And a lot of those arguments are well laid out in these papers, and they're actually very easy to read.
Thanks, John. Andrea?
Great, and I think I just want to reinforce the power of the risk assessment frame that is an apolitical frame. So not only is the military the most trusted institution in America for decades running, but they are able to look at this issue apolitically because that's built into our military system. And that gives the military tremendous credibility. You know, it reminds me in some ways of when the insurance industry looks at climate risk. There's no politics in there. They deal with risk for their profession. That's what they're in the business of doing. And they have to plan against that risk. It's the same with the military. So understanding that voice, and I will add one other point about that. The groups that are working at the nexus of military, of security and climate are exceptionally careful not to overstate causality. And to really say it like it is, what we know is causal and where the limits of that analysis are. And therefore, that further protects the integrity of what's communicated. So when we look at who communicates it, John pointed us back to these tremendous resources and documents. It's very important that people in the broader environmental community, especially organizations that are branded, rightly or wrongly, as more tipping toward the left, whenever possible, seek to empower military and national security leaders and groups to carry that message and not adopt that message within the environmental movement, because that further protects it and ensures that it has its own integrity and power.
So the quick anecdote from, and I'll steal this from my friend Mike Breen, who tells the story better than I do, but if I was a platoon leader, I was a platoon leader in Iraq, and if I was going down the road and 97 intelligence out of 100 intelligence officers told me that we were going to get attacked going down that road, I would be absolutely a failure as a leader to say, well, we're going to ignore that because 3% say that we're not going to, and I'm going to go down that road and get ambushed anyways. And so the military looks at it that way, right? There's a risk. We've got to identify the risk, and how do we manage the risk going forward?
Yeah, so just to sort of wrap this up, I think what you can say with absolute certainty is that climate change stresses governments. It's a force that pushes toward instability, whether it's through storms, whether it's through droughts, whether it's through changes in agricultural patterns, human migration, all across the globe. And the weaker the government, the more serious the consequences of the stress. That stress can be governmental services not supplied, security not available, and it can be conflict. And so I think if you cast climate change as a national security challenge that has to be answered, because one way or another, the United States gets drawn into these, as we have in Syria. If you cast it that way, it's the broadest possible foundation for bringing together consensus on the need to deal with climate change, the right policies, the right technologies, and so forth. So I think that it's the right place to start for most of America. Now, the question is then, what does the military really have to do with this? We are a large consumer of petroleum products, in fact, probably the largest. And when we send forces abroad, they do need energy. But beyond that, how does the military really relate to this? So, John, you were the lieutenant out there on the front lines. Tell us about it.
So let me tell you about it from the time I spent both in the Pentagon and at the White House looking at this from a pure management perspective for a second. The first thing I learned as a young lieutenant when I showed up to my Army unit, luckily I had a very grizzled platoon sergeant who had seen many versions of me come through, and he dragged me around to the side of the motor pool before I could address any of my soldiers and said, look, there's two types of leaders in the military. There's those that lead by rank and those that lead by example. Soldiers will follow those that outrank them because that's the way it works, but they want to follow someone that sets an example. And that value system permeates across the military. And so the military said, we're going to address it, and President Obama actually also said, we're going to address this from a leadership perspective. So look at the military. It has 3 times the square footage as Walmart, manages over 500,000 buildings. It has an electricity bill, the government's got an electricity bill of $4 billion a year. So we said, looking across that, how do we learn what's happening in industry and manage these from our renewable energy, from energy efficiency, electric huge vehicle fleet? How do you start to address these different components? And as a result, you've seen dramatic change across the actual footprint of the military. Each service has set a gigawatt renewable energy goal. The Navy's hit their goal. Just last month, the Army had a ribbon cutting in Fort Hood, Texas. Fort Hood, Texas, mind you. 65 megawatts of solar and wind, and it will save, over the course of a 30-year power purchase agreement, $100 million off its electricity bill. $100 million. So now the counter argument, as it starts to get pressure from Congress on action on this, it's not about doing this to go green. They're saving $100 million on the electricity bill. Lawrence Berkeley Lab put out a report last year that the military can meet 90% of its needs, critical energy needs, from renewable energy. So it's continued to move in that space, should continue it. We should learn from it, but also it needs to learn from Walmart, from Apple, from Google, from these other companies that are doing the same thing within data centers in their own footprint. And then I'm going to use Hampton Roads example that Sherri raised. 5 military bases, billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure. Major shipping companies like Northrop Grumman are building their ships in the area. So you can't just pick an electricity bill. Lawrence Berkeley Lab put out a report last year that the military can meet 90% of its needs, critical energy needs, from renewable energy. So it's continued to move in that space, should continue it. We should learn from it, but also it needs to learn from Walmart, from Apple, from Google, from these other companies that are doing the same thing within data centers in their own footprint. And then I'm going to use Hampton Roads example that Sherri raised. 5 military bases, billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure. Major shipping companies like Northrop Grumman are building their ships in the area. So you can't just pick up this area and move it. So we began this conversation where the bases were having climate planning exercises and saying we need to raise our dock and then take the substation or the power structure from underneath the dock because it was getting flooded on top, and doing a lot of these really important things on their base. But as Sherri said, the sailors and their families and the Marines don't live on the base. Some do, but not most of them. They live in the community. No one was talking to the community about this same challenge. So you had 5 little holes trying to do climate planning, and the community wasn't. So we started a pilot program to bring together the military leadership, the community leadership, and start to talk about, how are we going to address these things from a comprehensive community perspective. There's actually a great documentary that's coming out on this. I think it's showing on Friday from Roger Sorkin called Tidewater, right? I think the name of it.
It's here.
Oh yeah, it's a great film. It tells the story of what's going on down there, but it's what the military efforts around planning and leadership can help permeate into the community. So whether you look at the facilities here in Colorado, at Colorado Springs, or the military bases at Hampton Roads, there's a lot that we can work together on to solve some of these problems.
Okay, thanks, John. Andrea, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think there's a really exciting cross-pollination opportunity potential that you're talking about between large businesses that are proving out the business case and the military, and that businesses are looking at, I think a lot of us are aware of this, looking at ways to impact against this problem in supply chains, in their operations, and in a thought leadership role. And I think it's a parallel opportunity for the U.S. military. So we focus in our work primarily on the voice, but the voice becomes more powerful when the voice amplifies the business case. So that's just by way of reinforcing, I think, the importance of what John was saying.
Sherri?
Well, the military focuses on energy in large part to improve mission effectiveness and reduce cost. You can make the argument for improved energy performance and focus on clean, or what we're calling advanced energy. In fact, the CNA Military Advisory Board released just last week its latest report on advanced energy and U.S. national security. And there's no mention of climate change in here. In fact, climate change underlies all the work that the board's been doing for a decade. But you can make the argument that we should be moving to harness the power of advanced energy across our entire society and as a global competitive leader, because if we don't do it, others will. China's already, as you probably know, moved heavily into the solar and other market. We're still leading on innovation, but if we don't continue to invest in the research and development we need to stay at the forefront of this, we won't have we won't have that leadership capability. The military is unique because, as General Clark said, it is the nation's, and John, it is the nation's single largest energy user. So it has the ability to be a market leader. And so it's, in the last decade, it has begun to do so in part because, as General Mattis, Secretary Mattis said when he was in Iraq a decade ago, unleash us from the tether of fuel. He saw that our forces, our troops, our soldiers and Marines' lives were being put at risk by convoying fuel to the front, where unnecessary casualties were occurring. Now, that doesn't mean that the military is going to operate or that society is going to operate without fossil fuels in the foreseeable future. We know that's not the case, but we do know that advanced energy, renewables, as well as nuclear and hydro, can begin to move into key segments of the economy, that we can repower the economy in important ways, we can decarbonize, and we can improve performance, and we can begin also to stay ahead as countries like India and Nigeria become the most populous countries in the world. We need to help them power and learn the lessons, be smarter about the way they power their economies.
So I think one of the things you come out of this with is, we listen to all of our panelists, the military is actually a leading force in moving toward renewable energy, advanced energy, and dealing with climate change. So we're not lagging, we're actually leading. And in the context of our discussion yesterday and some of our concerns about regulatory capture, because the military focuses on the mission rather than CEO salaries, it's not subject to regulatory capture. So when you have advanced technologies, sometimes the best path for the implementation of those technologies is through the military. And then through the military, they get out into the rest of the country. Now, let's go to the third topic, and then I want to get into audience discussion. So let's go through this one relatively more quickly. So we know it's a national security issue on climate change. We know the military can do something to help. What, in a broader sense, does renewable energy do for us, and how does that promote our national security? So, Andrea, you want to lead off on this?
Well, my way of looking at this is a little bit different, so I'll share it. And that is that, clearly renewable energy has many concrete and tangible impacts on national security that I imagine John and Sherri are going to speak directly to. The point I want to make is that in this political moment, what the military is doing and the leadership the military is showing around advanced energy and around this message of national security threat multiplier is uniquely powerful because, as I mentioned, the climate issue got misbranded as a left environmental issue. It's a misbranding, and that needs to be corrected. But in the meantime, elected leaders who want to accelerate our transition to clean energy, who happen to be Republican and understand this issue, they need encouragement and they need political protection. And that is something that the military can most powerfully provide. In addition, we know that the poll numbers are getting better in terms of people across the political spectrum being concerned about this issue, but they don't care about it most. It's not salient. But what is salient is national security. So the pairing of the national security frame with the climate and the advanced energy economic case, it's this moment when both the public and elected leaders across the political spectrum both need to hear it and can make use of it.
Sherri, you want to come in on that?
Sure. Well, in the last decade of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as I mentioned, the military learned that it needed to reduce the risk to troops in remote forward operating bases. And for that reason, it moved towards reducing its energy and water footprint at the front by using renewables, wind, solar in particular, smart microgrids, ways to power the base, ways to provide water to the troops at the front that reduced us from the tether of fuel. So it's been leading in everything from foam insulation to power tents, rather than big generators, to micro wind. And we found now that many of the technologies innovations that were useful in those wars also have applications in other rural and remote locations. So for example, Alaskan villages, many of them still are powered by dirty diesel. Increasingly, they're able to reduce their reliance on diesel by doing something called wind diesel, where they integrate wind, micro wind, into diesel, and they're slowly moving, and then integrating smart microgrids. We're having the same sort of opportunities occurring across the African continent, where there's been energy poverty for years, and so many of those communities move to develop electricity. They're not doing so through dirty means. They're using either wind, solar, and smart and local microgrids. Now, the next decade of military operational planning is focused more on thinking that the fights will not be like what we experienced in Iraq and Afghanistan in remote rural regions, but they could be more what the military calls the maritime area, the littoral, the populated regions of the world. And those present different challenges, but some of those are going to be like the climate resilience challenges that our major urban areas are facing today. And that's why the innovations occurring in peacetime now in cities across the world to develop climate resilience, whether it's in Norfolk Hampton Roads or in Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Singapore, Hong Kong, to look at technologies and innovations that both power the community differently, but also make it resilient to sea level rise, storm surge, and support growing populations are very important.
And let me just add to this, the broader framework here. We still need energy independence in the United States. Over the last 40 years, we've spent trillions of dollars importing oil and funding regimes that don't agree with us. So the more we can do on renewable energy, the less dependent we are on others. That's primarily, we need help in the transportation sector because that's where we're using the oil. So all the innovation we can get in terms of renewable energy, batteries, advanced technologies in that, and get it into the commercial marketplace is really important. Now, if you look around the world and you listen to the rhetoric, you'll see that countries like Saudi Arabia say they have to move beyond oil, and they do. But don't kid yourself. The fighting in the Middle East today is about money, and the money is oil money. It's not only funding it, it's fueling the conflicts there. So the more we can do to shift away from an oil-based economy into a renewable energy world economy, the better, the safer, the greater the opportunity to move beyond this. We've got about 12 minutes left, so I want to get to the audience. John, you've got a quick intervention here.
The importance of this conversation today, to take it out of the military for a second, Rick Perry is putting out a report here within the next week or two, pre-written by a Koch brother think tank person that's now a political appointee at DOE that's going to argue, and they've sort of already put this out there, that baseload energy is the true national security. It's against everything the national security community has been saying for a long time, arguing that basically because we need a national grid, we need big baseload coal power plants, so they're going to use that argument to start attacking state-level renewable portfolio standards as a national security issue, right? I have an op-ed coming out of this next week. It's a counter to everything the community in the national security space has been saying for not only for a decade, but really very much triggered by Hurricane Sandy. Corporate America is saying the same thing. Walmart lost millions of dollars in frozen pizzas because they didn't have backup generation at their sites. Major facilities, companies like FedEx, right, weren't able to manage their shipping. Hospitals, schools were not able to function because that centralized grid was gone. Princeton University had a microgrid powered by renewables and some other offsets and was able to completely operate in the blackout, right? The community has seen this, and you have major corporations now going to this distributed generation model for data centers, for major operations, for critical things, and so is the military. And that's the real national security solution, and renewables tie into it, right? But so do these other distributed generation solutions. And we're going to have to really aggressively push back and not let Rick Perry and the Koch brothers try to own this argument in the next 60 days, because they're going to come out and you're going to hear more about it. We need to take the national security argument to where it should be, right?
Well, that's very important intervention, John. Thank you. Okay, let's go to the audience. National security. Question right here. We've got a microphone coming to you somewhere.
Okay.
Here it is.
Are electric military vehicles feasible? Renewables are cleaner, faster, safer, cheaper. Nuclear is dirtier, slower, more dangerous, more expensive. For national security, isn't nuclear power an oxymoron?
Just quickly on the electric vehicle front, what you're seeing a lot is hybrids, right? So the Navy's launched a hybrid ship that saved them millions of dollars on their official voyage, their first voyage. You're seeing a lot of localized electric vehicles on bases here at home, and you're going to see some of the problem is you have electric vehicles on the forward operating base is really tough to do, because that forward operating base is still basically driven by what's called JP8, right? Jet fuel, which is, because you think of it, the military's got one fuel source that has got to drive logistically across this major operation. It's really jet fuel and then diesel. So there's ways to get the hybrid engine, and I think they're looking at a lot of those things. And then I'll just quickly on nuclear, I just came back from a trip to Japan in March. Got to go down to Fukushima, which was incredibly disturbing to see what's happening there. Yeah, I think there are a lot of environmental reasons to look at nuclear. From a national security perspective, it can be incredibly challenging. And they are paying and will be paying for a century in the Fukushima region for the mistakes of the folks who were in charge of that plant.
Anyone else on the panel want to handle this? Question back here.
Yes. You know, the panel so far has mostly addressed the effect of climate change on national security. You know, one thing that has concerned me is the link between, you know, the things like deforestation and climate change have some of the same causes as some national security threats we face, such as terrorism. Deforestation and terrorism actually have some of the same roots. And those roots are kleptocracies in the developing world that basically don't allow people to enter the economy, operate with private property rights, that allows them to, you know, you can't have effective stewardship over massive amounts of acreage in the rainforest because governments simply don't have the resources to control it. So you would need some sort of private property rights, but they don't exist. So you have a tragedy of the commons, and you know, these resources get raped and despoiled. At the same time, that's driving that same kind of phenomenon is driving poverty in the third world enormously. You see, you know, in countries like Peru, for instance, had this terrible civil war driven by the Shining Path. They were able to stop that by trying to reforms that made the informal black market sector the legal market, that brought people into the legal market so they could own their homes and own their businesses. It expanded poverty, ended the Shining Path guerrilla movement. When you see the Arab Spring, 65% of those people, I mean, the 65 people who put themselves on fire, many of them were illegal, you know, street vendors whose lives were being made miserable by their governments. They couldn't make a living. That kind of kleptocracy in the third world is driving both problems.
Right, but the
so
question...
I wanted to ask,
So,
you know, whether
okay.
you see that problem and whether there's a, you know, there's a national security and climate change solution there by addressing that root cause.
Well, I think that one of the things that we are finding through this process is that all around the world, we're interested in job creation. And one of the most powerful job creation opportunities mankind has ever been presented with is to deal with climate change. And whether that's about halting deforestation or developing and deploying new technologies or changing the grid structure or many other facets of this, one of the things we have to get out into the political dialogue today is that climate change is not just a risk, and dealing with it is not just a cost. It is a tremendous opportunity for human innovation, for employment, and for moving to the next stage of civilization as we know it. And we've got to look at it as an opportunity, not as a cost. Next.
I was curious about.
I just want to say, Claude, you know, I agree with you on that. I think resource, you know, you could reframe what you said as resource scarcity of a variety of types, whether it's deforestation or rampant illegal fishing. You know, what we're seeing is sort of a raping and pillaging of our natural resources globally, and that is one of the causes of instability that leads to these conditions that allow kleptocracy, terrorists, authoritarians, because people need, first they need to survive, right? Before they need democracy, they need food, water, and shelter. You know, and so we see that now, you know, across the planet where people are driven into, you know, horrendous conditions because they basically, you know, across the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, they just don't have the resources to survive.
We had another question.
Curious about what each of you thought about. Yesterday, Bob Gow, who left this morning, talked about what was going on at Standing Rock and the water keepers up there, which many of us are supporting along with the veterans. And he was mentioning that the pipes that haven't even opened yet are leaking, have been tested for leaking, and the Army Corps of Engineers has just issued a report saying that they were at fault for approving this for a variety of reasons, which I hope opens it up again. So as part of a military installation looking for energy, the Rocky Mountain Institute has been working with us for years saying that's a wind belt. We've got the wind right there on site. Could we not transfer so there is energy production in a renewable way, and the water keepers, we can support them on our sacred water?
I agree with you. I mean, I think.
All right.
In short, yes.
Good statement.
Real quick
Next
question.
question.
Great panel, and great to have the national security perspective here. In the past, we've done manufacturing for strategic reasons, ammunition, et cetera. Is there a role for manufacturing solar panels domestically? We just had our two largest domestic manufacturers issue some bankruptcy statements.
Well, you know, the largest solar housing family, the largest solar housing in family units is on military bases in the United States, in Hawaii, and John just talked about Fort Hood. So I think there's, you know, the military can be a market leader in this area where there are strategic reasons for mission operational critical needs. You know, it will also, for example, batteries and storage. Those are the two critical technology needs. We need to be able to electrify our vehicle fleet nationwide, not just for the federal facilities, but nationwide. And in the next quarter century, we will undoubtedly be able to do that. And then the U.S. will be able to even further dramatically reduce its reliance on fossil fuels. And that is going to be, that's going to be a dramatic change. I mean, why would you not buy an electric vehicle when you can eliminate range anxiety? You know, you got better pickup, and you got, you know, all the attractions of fewer parts. It'll be the internal combustion engine will eventually fade away. It's just a matter of time. Now that's in the U.S. and other advanced countries, but that's not necessarily going to be the same around the world.
I've got some reservations about declaring solar panel manufacturing a critical national security need.
Right.
I just don't think we're there yet in the technology. I mean, the technology came from us. China is the lowest cost manufacturer because of economies of scale. They've got a system of policy making in their government that we frankly don't have. And they also see an urgency of need that our government doesn't see. But I think that were there to be a national emergency where you couldn't trade with China and you couldn't import solar panels, I suspect that the U.S. manufacturing base could come up to speed very, very quickly. There are technologies that you can't afford to lose. Chip making and some of the other advanced manufacturing for digital technology we have to maintain in this country, not only in wartime emergency, but in peacetime for our own security. And so our advanced chips, hardware, are made in this country. We won't buy them abroad. And it doesn't matter if they cost more. But I don't think we can make that case now. Our panel's out of time, and based on the excitement we had yesterday and what happened when we ran over and couldn't see the film last night, I'd like to thank you all for your participation. I'd like to thank our panel. Thank you very much. Remember, the most powerful argument we can make is the national security argument. We've got to come out of this and make that argument. Thank you.